Welcome. We're so glad that you chose to join us tonight for just this midweek connection. You know, I think a lot of us right now are trying to figure out how we stay connected, how we stay in community in the midst of all this social distancing. We're secretly 6 feet apart. This is CGI that's bringing us close by. But what we want to do is just provide an opportunity for us to connect once again. And so here's what we're going to do. My name is Adam Young. I'm the lead pastor at Element Church. This is Cameron Ross. Cameron just knocked it out of the park delivering the message this Sunday. And so what I'm going to do is Cameron's going to recap the message from Sunday, so in case you missed it. But if you did miss it, I want to encourage you to go back and take a listen and a watch. You can find that video on our Facebook page or on our website, yourelement.org. But Cameron's going to recap the message. We're going to talk about it just a little bit, and then we're going to provide some thought-provoking, deepening questions for you to discuss with others. Now, if you're looking for an opportunity to connect with people and discuss these things, a great way to do that is to do it with us right after this video. So at 6:30 tonight, we want to invite you to join us in a Zoom conference call. And that link to the Zoom conference call will be posted on our Facebook page. And this is open to anyone and everyone who would like to. And so jump in, we're going to talk about this sermon. We're going to talk about how it applies to our lives and what we do with it together. If you're already a part of an e-group, then I would encourage you to connect with your e-group leader. They'll have information about how you can connect with your e-group later this week and discuss these same questions. And so, Cameron, if you wouldn't mind, I would love just for a few minutes if you kind of recap what you talked about on Sunday.
Yeah, definitely. So we've been in this series, as many of you know, Grand Narrative, and many weeks now, and actually wrapping it up this upcoming week. But this week we were looking at the church and the growth of the church, the development of the church. And so to do that, I wanted to look at the first time we saw the word church show up in the New Testament, because I think the word that is used in the Greek that is translated into church means a lot of different things than what we picture as church. And so we went back and we looked at that word in Matthew 16, where Jesus is having this conversation with his guys, and he has this interesting question that he asks. First of them, just to kind of get them talking, but then he turns this casual conversation towards this question of, who do you say that I am? Which is really the defining question of Christianity writ large, and the grand narrative as a whole in a lot of ways. But very personal question that he turns to his guys and asks. And Peter just gives a great answer. And Jesus uses that to talk about how he's going to launch his church, which in the Greek, as you know, is ekklesia. And ekklesia just means an assembly of people surrounding a particular reason or unifying principle. And it's not a building, it's not a place you go to or a thing you do, but it's rather a who, or a set of who's. It's a group of people united, and as Jesus kind of points out in this case, united around him. And the answer to that question of, who do you say that I am? And so we looked at that, and then we looked at sort of the growth of the church after that, because really in Acts is when we first see the church start expanding and growing outside of the Jesus, being on earth in his ministry. And so we looked at the growth of that, including Paul and his conversion, and then his missionary journeys all throughout the region, where he's planting these little ecclesias, these little assemblies, and the church continues to grow long after the Bible ends, all the way to today, to where we are the living embodiment of the church today. So that's sort of wraps up, a couple minutes what we talked about, but I think we're going to dive in a little bit deeper now.
That's great. And just again, if you didn't get a chance to watch or listen into the message this weekend, the video from the service this weekend can be found on our Facebook page, on our website, and then you can also subscribe to our church sermon podcast and get the audio that way. So you mentioned this word ekklesia, which is Greek. Our New Testament part of the Bible was written in Greek, and from that word we translate it most of the time in our English Bibles as the word church. A lot of us have a lot of ideas when we hear that word church. So maybe can you just speak to what that word, you kind of mentioned it already, what it does and what it doesn't mean.
Yeah, so it's an interesting kind of progression throughout history, because it starts as ecclesia, and really in the early church, when there's not a huge formal structure, a lot of it's these small sort of house movements or people in communities getting together for these feasts. They call them love feasts, where they'd bring food and they would worship and they would pray and they would do things together. And then as Christianity goes along and eventually becomes, allowed religion within the Roman Empire and then eventually the religion of the Roman Empire, it starts taking on a lot more structure, a lot more adornment, a lot more ritual, which are not bad things, right? All with meaning behind them, and as long as we understand those meaning, it's good stuff. But eventually that kind of gets translated and changed, and eventually we get to the word church, which actually comes from a German word. And we've started to think of it as the building oftentimes. I think most people in America look at the church as a place you go to, a place where formal services are held. But as we see when we look back both at the original word and the original use of it after Jesus' life, we see something very different, right? We see a gathering of people getting together to worship God, to spend time together, to do all the one anothering, that they talk about in the New Testament. Love one another, pray for one another, all of those things. And so we see it as a very different concept, particularly in early in the practice.
That's good. And I think it's a great question and idea for all of us to discuss together. And so here's the first question that I would love for you to discuss, whether you're talking about this at home with your spouse or your family, or you're connecting to one of our e-groups, or you're going to join our Zoom conference call, is if the church really isn't a building, it's not something we go to, and it's not something that we just attend. If church is the people, then what implications does that have for us today? And we could even talk about that in two ways. One, how does that have an implication for us today when all these things that we normally think of as church aren't even accessible? Like we can't go to a building. There's not something for us to attend or go to. And so what are the implications of this idea that the church is the people? What impact does that have for us today? But then I think also for us to discuss what does that mean for us 6 months, 9 months from now, when we have passed through this social distancing period and we get to go back to a building. There is a church service that we get to attend. There is a church location or program that we get to go to. What are the implications that are still there if the church is none of those things? Really, it's the people. So take a moment with your group and discuss that together. Now, in your message, you made this big statement when talking about the church and this moment in Matthew 16. And you talked about that question just a minute ago. Who do you say that I am? And then you had this statement in your message that you said essentially this ecclesia, this church, will be defined by how the people answer this question. And that question comes out of Matthew chapter 16, verse 15. And I'll start where you started in your sermon. So I'll start in verse 13 and read through verse 15. It says, "Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that the Son of Man is?' And they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.'" And you walked us through that on Sunday. And then verse 15, "And he said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?'" And really how we answer that question defines who the church is. And so I think another great question for all of us to discuss is, how do we know who the church is? If it's not a what, it's a who. How do we know who the church is? And so whether you're at home or whether you're on some kind of conference call discussing this, I want us as a group to discuss that question. How do we know who the church is? And as we're discussing that, I think too, it's important to note that the church sort of, the New Testament sort of makes this distinction that there's kind of two understandings of church. There's like the global and then the local. Sometimes we show that when we're writing by using like a capital C or a lowercase c. The global church is this idea of anybody who answers that question of, Jesus is the Son of God, the Christ, the Messiah, like you talked about on Sunday, as Peter answers. So there's that where we're all connected together as a global church of anyone who answers that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah. But then there's that local expression of how this works out in a local setting. And the New Testament even talks about local churches, that it's a group of people who come together in that same way, like answer the question the same way, but are connected locally.
Yes.
And so in that passage that I just read, and you mentioned this on Sunday, that Matthew 16, the first couple verses there, 13 and 14, was kind of that generic, who do people say that I am? Mm-hmm. And then then you made this great statement in your sermon where you said, and then Jesus, as he always does, he turns it very personal.
Yes.
He looks at his disciples and says, who do you say that I am? And I think in many ways that's exactly what Jesus does even now.
Oh, yes.
As we read this story, there's that generic question of who do people say that I am? And in our culture, there's a lot of answers to that.
A lot of answers to that. Actually, and it's really interesting too, because most of the people in our culture are like Jesus, even if they don't accept
Sure.
the theology behind him, right? Most people aren't against Jesus. In fact, a lot of religions try to claim Jesus, right? Islam claims him as a prophet. Christianity obviously upholds him. A lot of people think of him as a great moral teacher, that maybe, he's not the son of God, but I'll accept that he's at least a good moral teacher on the level of Buddha or others. But what I love about this is Jesus used such a tactical approach to get his guys to a point that he wants to make with them, right? Yeah. He starts with a question that's very, innocuous, very open, and then just walks them into something more personal. And I think, just as a side note, that's a great way that we can talk to people and talk to others about faith and church, right? We don't have to rush in with, a trap if it's not the right situation, but it can be a time where we can use questions to sort of tease some things out. But getting back to your question, so Jesus dives into this, and he asks this question. A huge portion of the grand narrative, what we've been talking about the last several weeks, is this idea of relationship between God and man.
Yeah.
Right, as you mentioned in week 2, that it was that broken relationship from the fall that really sets this whole thing awry, right?
Yeah.
And that we are made from communion for communion. And so a lot of this is, how do we restore communion, or God's plan to restore communion with man? And so a fundamental question of this is, what is our relationship with Heavenly Father, right? And not just as a global church, but as an individual, and as we meet as local churches. And so Jesus turns this question directly towards that, and he cuts right through everything to the heart of it, and he says, hey, who do you say that I am? Because I want to know where we're at, right, relationally.
That's good, and I think that's a great question for us to discuss in our groups as well. Is maybe you can start with, who do people say that Jesus is? So you can talk about how maybe people at your work or your school, in your neighborhood, how would they answer that question? Who is Jesus? But ultimately, what Jesus gets to in this story, and I think where we should go in our discussion is, well, who do you say that Jesus is? And I mean, that is the big question. Like, not only in the story, but in our lives, and in the grand narrative, that great big story, is how we answer that question. And so I encourage you, as you're discussing this, is to not skip over that. Don't do the easy thing and say, who do other people say Jesus is, but who do you say that Jesus is? And I think that's a great kind of final question for our groups to discuss this week with one another as they continue connecting and kind of diving deeper into this idea.
Yeah, and I think it's really good to explore not just what is your head answer, right? Because I think all of us, particularly if you're joining into something like this, that you have a head answer, but where in your heart, where in your life are you seeing that that's not actually maybe playing out the way your head answer does? That's good.
Well, Cameron, thank you for joining me today. Thank you for an incredible message this weekend. And again, we want to connect with you and want to help you stay in community and stay connected. And so if you don't have a place to connect, then we want to invite you right now at 6:30 is when our Zoom conference call will start. So the link is posted on our website and Facebook. So join in, get to be a part of this discussion, this community. And we look forward to diving deeper and connecting more as we discuss this stuff.